Welcome to the second lecture on Elizabethan foreign policy. In this lecture, we will study why Anglo-Spanish relations deteriorated throughout Elizabeth's reign. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. We will start by examining why Elizabeth tried to maintain a cordial relationship at the start of her reign, but why this deteriorated due to Spain and England having conflicting interests. We will then examine the way in which relations deteriorated from the late 1560s, and how at this stage England and Spain were engaged in a Cold War. We will then examine how tensions escalated into a hot war by 1587, and how this resulted in the Spanish Armada. Finally, we will consider how and why the war between England and Spain continued until the death of Elizabeth in 1603. In 1558, England and Spain were in a dynastic alliance as a result of Mary's marriage to Philip II. As a result of this, England was officially at war with France, and in January 1558 England lost Calais to a surprise attack by the Duke of Guise. As a result of this alliance, Philip proposed marriage to Elizabeth in order to maintain the Anglo-Habsburg alliance. Elizabeth rejected his proposal for 2 reasons. Firstly, for religious reasons, as she was determined to establish the Anglican Church through the Elizabethan settlement. Secondly, she knew how unpopular the Spanish match had been with the English nobility, and did not want to face the same level of opposition, or indeed, to risk England becoming dependent upon Spain. Despite this, both Philip and Elizabeth wished to maintain a cordial relationship. Between 1559 and 1560, Elizabeth was facing aggression from Francis II of France, who was the wife of Mary, Queen of Scots. This meant that Elizabeth had to maintain a strong relationship with Spain, so that she could focus her efforts on this combined threat. Philip in return had little to gain from war with England, especially since his focus was on the establishment of New World colonies. Let's now examine how and why the Anglo-Spanish relations deteriorated from the late 1560s. There were 2 main reasons: the situation in the New World and the situation in the Netherlands. During the 1560s, the Spanish increased their presence in the Netherlands. Philip had a territorial claim to this region, as a descendant of the old Dukes of Burgundy. England's trade relations with the Netherlands strengthened throughout the mid-Tudor age, and there was now a healthy cloth trade between merchants based in London and Antwerp. Therefore, Elizabeth had a vested interest in keeping the Netherlands as an autonomous nation. The Dutch were also undergoing their own Reformation, which split the Netherlands into a Protestant north and Catholic south. So, like with the Huguenots in France, Elizabeth felt a moral responsibility to support the Protestant Dutch. This placed Elizabeth under moral pressure to support the Protestants. Secondly, unlike her predecessors, Elizabeth had an interest in New World exploration, and this put English explorers in direct conflict with their Spanish counterparts. Spain had already begun to establish colonies in the Americas, especially in the Caribbean, modern-day Mexico and Venezuela, and this put the English in a disadvantage, since England had yet to establish a single colony. The tension between Spain and England could be described as a Cold War for various reasons. The first reason is that during this time the 2 nations were funding privateers to harass each other's merchant fleets. This resulted in regular skirmishes and trade embargoes, but never resulted in a fully fledged conflict. Secondly, the the support for the Protestant or Catholic cause in the Netherlands could be considered a type of proxy war, whereby they were financing the conflict based on religious or ideological beliefs. Thirdly, both Elizabeth and Philip had a sophisticated spy network that engaged in intrigue and espionage to undermine the authority of the other nation. Despite these Cold War tensions, historians agree that both Elizabeth and Philip did not intend to engage in a hot war, but by the mid-1580s, these tensions escalated out of control. In order to gain a foothold in the New World, Elizabeth and key members of her Privy Council provided support to privateers. These were essentially pirates, who were given a license by their home nation to raid the New World ports of their rivals and to attack foreign galleons. By Elizabeth's reign, the Spanish were making regular transatlantic voyages that contained New World treasures, especially silver and gold. If a brave crew could attack these galleons, then this would provide a healthy profit. It was also very difficult to prove whether they acted on their own as pirates or as state-funded privateers. The most famous English privateer of the 1560s was called John Hawkins, who did several transatlantic voyages throughout the 1560s. Since he was not able to engage in traditional trades with the Spanish, Hawkins instead established a slave trade. This became the foundation of the transatlantic slave trade that existed through to the early 19th century. In 1568, tensions came to a head between the Spanish and English privateers at San Juan de Ulua, which is a port in modern-day Mexico. The Spanish accused John Hawkins of smuggling, though he claimed he was conducting legitimate trade, and a naval battle broke out after Hawkins docked his fleet of 6 merchant ships in San Juan de Ulua in order to replenish stocks. Hawkins was outnumbered, and as a result of the battle he lost 4 out of 6 ships in his fleet. He returned to England with only a crew of 15 men, and accused the Spanish of treachery. This began a new stage in Anglo-Spanish relations, which some historians have called a Cold War between the two nations, the war fought by proxy through the privateers in the New World. In retaliation for the Battle of San Juan de Ulua, Elizabeth decided to impound a Spanish galleon that had become shipwrecked off the English coast. The ship contained 400,000 florins, which was a loan from a Florentine bank. This money was en route to the Netherlands and was supposed to fund the Spanish military efforts there. The impoundment was a deliberate action by Elizabeth, and it increased tensions further. This was made worse when a revolt broke out among the Spanish soldiers due to a lack of pay, and this further served to escalate tensions in the Netherlands between the Protestants and Catholics. Relations deteriorated further as a result of the 1571 Ridolfi plot. This was the first Catholic plot to place Mary Queen of the Scots on the throne, and the Spanish ambassador, Don Guerau de Espes, was implicated as one of the key conspirators. As a result, Elizabeth expelled him from the English court. This incident had serious implications for diplomatic relations. Philip was clearly doing what he could to undermine Elizabeth's authority, even though he probably knew that the plot had a limited chance of success. In retaliation, Elizabeth's expulsion of the Spanish ambassador sent a clear signal that she had no intention of appeasing Philip or repairing the relationship. During the 1570s, Elizabeth began to slowly invest more money into the Protestant Dutch cause. At the same time, the Spanish increased their presence. In the next lecture, we will study these events in the Netherlands in greater detail. However, these actions were the precursor to the proxy war that would take place in the mid-1580s, whereby the English and Spanish were fighting in the Netherlands for the Protestant or Catholic cause. In this way, it is not dissimilar to the actions of the USA and the Soviet Union during the Vietnam War. In 1580, a dynastic crisis broke out in Portugal between the grandson of the previous king called Don Antonio and Philip II of Spain. As part of the Cold War, Elizabeth endorsed Don Antonio's claim to the Portuguese throne. She provided financial assistance to Don Antonio during his attack of the coastal region of Azores. However, this was a token amount designed to aggravate Philip. It made no impact on the outcome of the dynastic struggle. Philip was able to annex Portugal. This had implications for New World trade as Philip now gained control of Portuguese colonies, such as those established in modern-day Brazil, and he gained access to ports on the west coast of Portugal, which strengthened his trade routes across the Atlantic. The conflict in the Netherlands escalated further in the early 1580s. One reason for this is the arrival of the Duke of Parma as the Governor-General of the Spanish army in the Netherlands. Under Parma, the Spanish were able to make military advances. Furthermore, in 1584, the Spanish made a secret pact with the Catholic League in France, with the aim of eradicating Protestantism from Europe and challenging England. The pact did not remain secret for long, and in retaliation, Elizabeth signed the Treaty of Nonsuch with the Dutch Protestants in 1585, which pledged both financial and military support in the Netherlands. This was followed by a military campaign headed by the Earl of Leicester, bringing the proxy war between England and Spain to a head. Furthermore, in the 1580s there were two major plots to place Mary on the throne, both of which had Spanish endorsement. The Spanish ambassador was implicated in the 1583 Throckmorton plot, and for the larger 1586 Babington plot, Philip vowed to commit troops to invade England following the successful assassination of Elizabeth. In early 1587, Elizabeth finally made the decision to execute Mary for her supposed complicity in the Babington plot. This has been seen by some historians as the trigger for the Spanish Armada, since Elizabeth had committed regicide by executing an anointed Catholic queen. In early 1487, Philip pledged to amass an invasion fleet, which would become known throughout history as the Spanish Armada. It would take 18 months for this fleet to be ready to set sail, and this meant it was no secret Elizabeth knew and had time to prepare her defense. Philip hoped for a successful invasion of England, or at the very least to place himself in a defensive position off the English coast, whereby he could negotiate for the freedom of worship for English Catholics, and a financial settlement that would compensate for the expense of war in the Netherlands. It is difficult to know what he would have done if the Armada had been successful, since he was unable to rule there in person, and the execution of Mary meant no obvious Catholic claimant. However, it is likely he would have put a puppet government in place. In 1587, Francis Drake executed a daring raid on the Spanish port of Cadiz. Leading a fleet of English ships, Drake successfully destroyed or captured several Spanish vessels, crippling the Spanish Armada's preparations, and dealing a significant blow to Spanish naval power. His actions delayed the launch of the Armada by several months, giving the English time to prepare. England were well prepared for the Armada. For example, there were beacons stationed all across the south coast of England, from Cornwall to Kent. This meant that when the fleet was first sighted off Land's End, the first beacon would be lit. A watchman would see the next beacon, and light their beacon, and so forth. This meant the English earned valuable hours to prepare their fleet for the battle. Whilst it is important to discuss the Armada as part of an essay on Anglo-Spanish relations, it is also very important to not spend too much time describing the narrative of events. The most important thing to remember is that the English were able to defeat the Spanish through a combination of both luck and good tactics. Francis Drake played a brilliant strategic move when sending the fire ships over the Channel Sea to disrupt the Spanish fleet's half-moon defensive formation. However, the wind was also in England's favor, and once the Spanish fleet was scattered, the wind drove the fleet north, leading to several shipwrecks in the North Sea. It's also important to remember that Elizabeth used the defeat of the Spanish Armada as a huge propaganda opportunity. The Armada portrait is the best example of this. It shows Elizabeth with her hand on the globe, pointing to the New World, whilst in the background the naval battle rages. Following the defeat of the Armada, there were huge celebrations across the country, and the Crown commissioned many celebratory banners, pamphlets, and ballads to celebrate the event. In all of these, there was reference to the Protestant wind, the wind that turned the tide against the Spanish, which was seen as God's judgment that Elizabeth's Protestant cause was righteous. However, the defeat of the Spanish Armada did not mean the end of the Anglo-Spanish War. This continued right through the 1590s. England launched a counter-armada in 1589, but this was a disaster. The Spanish also sent 3 further armadas in 1596, 1597, and 1601. Each of these attacks were weaker than the last, and they all failed. Nonetheless, Elizabeth had to continue to invest money into the defense of the southern coast and prioritize defense as part of her foreign policy. This, some historians have considered a failing, since Elizabeth's key aim throughout her reign had been to avoid war at all costs. The Spanish also supported the Catholics in Ireland during the Tyrone Rebellion, otherwise known as the 9 Years' War. This rebellion was led by Irish chieftain Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, against the English, following Elizabeth's attempt to set up Protestant colonies along the west coast. The English attempted to sue for peace with the Irish, but Philip's promise of funding and military support put an end to the peace talks. Philip then sent an armada to Ireland in 1596, but it was defeated. It wasn't until 1601 that the Spanish were able to land troops in Ireland. 3,500 men landed on the southern coast and took control of the town of Kinsale. They remained there under siege by the English for a year, before finally relenting their position. Though the Spanish were outnumbered by the English in Ireland, this was an expensive venture that had consequences for the English economy. The ongoing Anglo-Spanish War had devastating consequences for the English economy. Elizabeth had to rely on Parliament for subsidies to fund the war, asking first for a triple and then a quadruple subsidy amount. She also began the unpopular practice of granting monopolies to trade companies as a way of receiving cash in the short term. Both the over-reliance on Parliament and the monopolies would have a devastating impact for the Stuart age, as it raised tensions between the Crown and the merchant class. The country also suffered from successive harvest failings during the 1590s, which compounded this problem. As a result, inflation rates soared and Elizabeth struggled to keep the country solvent. It is said that when James I inherited the throne, he inherited an empty treasury, but a wardrobe of dresses for every day of the year. History remembers Elizabeth's reign as a golden age, and in the final decade, she fostered a cult of personality around her as Gloriana, the queen who founded the Anglican faith and brought economic growth to England. However, historians have been critical of her final decade as queen due to the strain of the ongoing war with Spain. The period was certainly one of court factionalism, especially following the deaths of her 2 chief ministers, William Cecil and Robert Dudley. Yet it is hard to know what alternative action Elizabeth, or her Privy Council, could have taken during the 1590s, since Spain had no intention of suing for peace. Therefore, it is perhaps best to remember that Elizabeth and her military commanders prevented a Spanish invasion, even though it came at an economic and political cost. The Anglo-Spanish War did not end until the death of Elizabeth in March 1603. Philip II died 5 years previously in 1598, and his successor Philip III found the ongoing cost of war against both the Dutch and English very costly. When James succeeded to the throne, he took on a peacemaker role, and so actively sought a solution. It nonetheless took a year of peace talks to end the Anglo-Spanish War, which was finalized with the Treaty of London in 1604. Let's now return to the overarching question of why did Anglo-Spanish relations deteriorate throughout Elizabeth's reign? Firstly, remember that England had been in an alliance with Spain due to Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain. This ended when Elizabeth rejected Philip's marriage proposal in 1559, and whilst the two monarchs tried to keep their relationship amicable throughout the 1560s, it nonetheless deteriorated as a result of Elizabeth's interests in New World exploration. During the 1570s and early 1580s, England and Spain were engaged in what can best be described as a Cold War. They funded rival religious groups. For example, Elizabeth supported both the French Huguenots and the Dutch Protestants, whilst Philip conspired to place Mary Queen of Scots on the English throne and also established a Catholic league with the Guise faction of France. Despite this, during this middle period of Elizabeth's reign, there was a concerted effort on both sides to avoid going directly to war with one another. However, the tensions came to a head in 1587, following Elizabeth's reluctant decision to execute Mary Queen of Scots, and also her commitment of troops on the ground in the Netherlands. This resulted in the most famous event of Tudor history, the 1588 defeat of the Spanish Armada. However, England's defeat of the Armada did not end the Anglo-Spanish War. This would continue throughout the 1590s, and would not end until the death of Elizabeth in 1603. Whilst England was able to successfully defend her shores, it cost the crown both financially and reputationally, with many historians considered the 1590s to be the worst decade of Elizabeth's reign.